All 7 beachfront villas belong to us. This useless old woman gets nothing. My son-in-law's voice cut through the polished silence of the lawyer's office, loud and triumphant, as if he had just announced a victory everyone had been waiting for, and for a brief moment, no one corrected him, no one even hesitated, because the room responded exactly the way he expected it to, with laughter, with satisfied nods, with the kind of applause people give when they believe the outcome is already decided. And I sat there in my chair, hands folded neatly in my lap, my back straight against the leather, watching them celebrate my erasure as though it were a family achievement rather than a quiet betrayal unfolding in plain sight, the morning sunlight spilling through the tall windows and catching the edges of the polished mahogany table where the will documents rested, still slightly askew from where the attorney had placed them. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small, a stack of paper, could carry the weight of 32 years of marriage, of long summers spent by the ocean overseeing construction crews, of winters spent reviewing financial statements while my husband, Robert Whitmore, sat beside me with his reading glasses low on his nose, trusting me with every decision that built those 7 beachfront villas from empty stretches of sand into the kind of properties people dreamed about owning, and yet here we were. Barely 2 weeks after we buried him, and my son-in-law, Daniel Brooks, was already speaking as if all of it had belonged to him all along, his hand resting possessively on the back of my daughter Emily's chair as she kept her eyes lowered, not meeting mine, not correcting him, not even shifting in discomfort, and that silence from her, more than his words, settled heavily in the room, because it confirmed what I had been quietly noticing for years, the subtle changes. The conversations that stopped when I entered, the decisions made without me, the gradual rewriting of my place in my own family until I had become, in their version of things, nothing more than an aging inconvenience waiting to be moved aside, and still, I did not interrupt, I did not argue, I did not raise my voice, because there is a particular kind of power in letting people reveal exactly who they are when they think they have already won, and Daniel continued, his confidence growing with every approving glance from his parents seated across the table, already discussing which villa might sell fastest, which one could be turned into a luxury rental, their voices overlapping in a casual frenzy that treated decades of my life like items on an inventory list, and I noticed the attorney, James Carter, hesitate just slightly, his pen hovering above the document as if something about the certainty in the room did not quite align with what he knew, but he said nothing, perhaps assuming that whatever questions he had would resolve themselves once the formalities were complete, and that was when I finally moved, just a small shift, a quiet adjustment of my sleeve, enough to draw his attention without acknowledging anyone else in the room, because Daniel's voice, loud as it was, no longer mattered to me. Nor did the murmured plans of his family, and I turned my gaze directly to the attorney, meeting his eyes with a calm that did not match the story they believed they were watching unfold, and I spoke in a tone so even it almost disappeared beneath the echo of their celebration. You really don't know, do you? And in that single moment, the energy in the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way a tide changes direction beneath the surface, because the man who had just been treated as a formality suddenly froze, his expression tightening as realization began to catch up with him, while behind me, the laughter continued for just a second longer, unaware that the story they were celebrating had never belonged to them in the first place. The room did not erupt all at once, it unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from a carefully woven fabric, because while Daniel was still smiling and his parents were still speaking over one another about profits and renovations, the attorney was no longer moving, his pen remained suspended just above the page. His eyes locked on me with a growing uncertainty that did not belong in a room where everything was supposed to be settled, and I could see the exact moment when his confidence faltered, when the neat, predictable version of events he had prepared for began to slip out of alignment with what he was now sensing. And that hesitation, small as it was, created a pause just long enough for the noise behind him to begin sounding out of place, too loud, too premature, like applause before the final act had even begun, and I kept my hands folded, my posture unchanged, because there was no need to rush, not now, not after all these years of being patient, of being overlooked. of being quietly moved aside in conversations that used to include me, and I let the silence grow just a fraction longer before he finally cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the chatter in a way that demanded attention without raising his voice, and one by one, the others began to quiet down, not because they understood what was happening, but because something in his expression suggested that they should, and Daniel was the last to stop speaking, his smile lingering just a second too long, as if he expected the moment to correct itself. As if the script he had already written in his mind could not possibly be wrong, and the attorney lowered his pen slowly, placing it beside the document instead of signing anything, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the paper as he glanced down, then back up at me, and I watched him carefully, recognizing that look, because I had seen it before in boardrooms and contract negotiations, the moment when someone realizes there is a clause they have not considered, a detail they have overlooked. Something small that changes everything, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, no longer procedural, no longer confident, but measured, cautious. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, choosing his words with care, "there may be additional documents that need to be reviewed before we proceed." And that was when the room truly changed, not with a dramatic reaction, but with a quiet ripple of confusion that moved from one person to another. Daniel straightened in his seat, his hand tightening on the back of Emily's chair as he let out a short laugh that did not quite land. "What additional documents?" he asked, his tone still edged with certainty but now carrying the first trace of irritation, and Emily finally looked up, her eyes flickering between me and the attorney, searching for something she could not yet name, and I did not look at her, not yet, because this was not her moment to understand, this was his, and the attorney reached for the folder in front of him, flipping through its contents with a precision that betrayed his growing urgency, scanning page after page as if the answer might reveal itself faster if he moved quickly enough, and I could see the shift deepen, the realization taking shape behind his eyes, because the document he had just read aloud was not the whole story. It was only the part they had been meant to hear first, and I let that truth settle into the room without announcing it, because the most powerful moments are not the ones that are explained, they are the ones that are discovered, piece by piece, until there is no room left for denial, and when he finally stopped turning pages, his hand resting on something he had not yet revealed, the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was heavy, expectant, filled with the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not match the celebration that had just taken place, and for the first time since he had spoken so boldly, Daniel did not interrupt, he only watched, waiting, unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. The attorney did not speak right away, and that silence stretched just long enough for discomfort to settle into every corner of the room, because people who believe they have already won do not know how to sit with uncertainty, and Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his fingers tapping once against the chair before he forced them still, as if even that small movement might betray something he was not ready to admit. While Emily's gaze remained fixed on the folder now resting beneath the attorney's hand, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and something deeper she had not yet allowed herself to name, and I remained exactly where I was, watching without urgency, because this moment did not require my voice, it required theirs, their realization, their slow understanding that what they had just celebrated might not belong to them at all, and when the attorney finally lifted the document from the folder, he did so carefully, as though the weight of it had changed since the last time he had touched it, his eyes scanning the first page again before he looked up, not at Daniel, not at Emily, but at me, seeking confirmation without asking for it, and I gave him nothing more than a steady, patient look, the kind that tells someone they are already on the right path, and he exhaled quietly before speaking. "There appears to be a codicil," he said, the word landing in the room with a quiet gravity that most of them did not immediately understand, but they felt it anyway, because tone often carries more truth than language, and Daniel frowned, leaning forward slightly. "A what?" he asked, the edge in his voice sharper now, stripped of the easy confidence he had worn just moments before, and the attorney turned the page toward him just enough to make the point without relinquishing control of it. "An amendment to the original will," he clarified, his voice steady but cautious. executed 6 months before Mr. Whitmore's passing. And that was when the first real crack appeared, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, because Daniel's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to reveal that this was not part of the version of events he had been expecting, and I could see the calculation begin behind his eyes, the quick mental adjustments, the search for a way to bring the situation back under his control. But control is a fragile thing when it is built on incomplete information, and Emily's hand moved almost unconsciously to the edge of the table, her fingers brushing against the polished surface as if grounding herself in something solid, while the reality around her began to shift, and the attorney continued, his gaze returning to the document as though it might be safer to read from it than to look directly at the people it would affect. This codicil outlines specific conditions regarding the distribution of the beachfront properties, he said, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and the room grew quieter with each sentence, the earlier excitement dissolving into a tense stillness that no one attempted to break, because now they understood that something important had been overlooked, something that could not be dismissed or laughed away, and Daniel leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as if reclaiming space might restore his authority. Then read it, he said, his tone firm but no longer triumphant, and I watched him closely, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm clarity that comes from seeing the full picture. Long before anyone else realizes it exists, because what he did not yet understand was that this was not a correction to the story he had been telling, it was an entirely different story altogether, one that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface, and as the attorney adjusted the document in his hands and prepared to continue, I felt no need to intervene, no need to guide the moment, because the truth, when it finally arrives, does not require assistance, it simply unfolds, and those who thought they were in control are left to catch up to it. The attorney adjusted his glasses before he began to read, and the sound of the papers shifting in his hands seemed louder than it should have been, as if the room itself had grown quieter in anticipation, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before. In the event of my passing, he read, all 7 beachfront properties shall be held under a protected family trust. And Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, as though this confirmed what he had already assumed, but the attorney did not pause, did not acknowledge him, he continued. The primary beneficiary and controlling trustee shall be my wife, Margaret Whitmore. And that was the moment the air changed, not abruptly, but with a subtle shift that moved through the room like a slow tide, because words, once spoken, cannot be taken back, and I saw Daniel's posture stiffen, his arms uncrossing slightly as if his body reacted before his mind could catch up, while Emily's eyes widened just enough to betray that she had not known, not fully, not like this, and the attorney continued reading, each sentence deliberate, leaving no space for interruption. No transfer, sale, or management decision regarding these properties may occur without her direct written approval. And the earlier conversations about selling, about dividing, about expanding, all of it seemed to dissolve into something thin and uncertain, because the authority they had claimed so confidently was now being rewritten in front of them, line by line, and Daniel leaned forward again, his voice sharper now. That does not change anything, he said quickly, as if speaking fast enough might restore control. She cannot manage that kind of portfolio on her own. And I did not look at him, not yet, because this was not the part where I responded, this was the part where he revealed himself further, where he reached for certainty that was no longer available to him, and the attorney glanced up briefly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, before continuing. Furthermore, he read, his tone steady, any individual who attempts to coerce, intimidate, or undermine the authority of the primary trustee shall be immediately excluded from any present or future financial benefit derived from said trust. And that was when the room truly fell silent, because even those who did not fully understand legal language could recognize the meaning behind those words, and Daniel's mouth opened slightly before closing again, the confidence that had filled his voice earlier now replaced by something tighter, more controlled, while his parents shifted in their seats, exchanging quick glances that carried a question neither of them wanted to say out loud. And Emily's hand withdrew from the table, resting now in her lap as if she no longer trusted the ground beneath her, and I sat there, still composed, still quiet, because none of this required my reaction, not yet, and the attorney lowered the document just slightly, his eyes moving across the final lines before he spoke again. "The purpose of this provision," he continued, reading Robert's words exactly as they had been written, "is to ensure that my wife is treated with the respect and dignity she has always deserved, and to protect her from those who may see her not as family, but as an obstacle." And that sentence did not echo, it settled, it anchored itself in the room in a way that no raised voice ever could, and for the first time since the reading had begun, no one moved, no one spoke, because the truth had arrived in full, not as an argument, not as a confrontation, but as something far more difficult to resist, something written, signed, and placed exactly where it needed to be long before any of them believed they had the upper hand, and I finally allowed my gaze to shift, just slightly, not to challenge, not to confront, but simply to acknowledge what was now undeniable, because the story they had been celebrating had ended, and the one they had not prepared for had just begun. No one spoke after the attorney finished reading, and the silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt heavy, like something had settled into place that could not be undone, and Daniel was the first to move, though even that movement lacked the certainty he had shown earlier, his hand sliding off the back of Emily's chair as he straightened fully, his jaw tightening as he looked from the document to the attorney, and then finally toward me, as if trying to decide which version of reality he should respond to. The one he had walked into the room believing, or the one now unfolding in front of him, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled, but there was a strain beneath it that had not been there before. "This does not change the fact that she cannot handle this alone," he said slower now, choosing each word carefully as though precision might restore his footing. 7 properties, multiple tenants, maintenance, taxes, legal compliance, that is not something you just manage without experience. And I listened without interrupting, because this was not new, this tone, this assumption, this quiet insistence that I was less capable than I had always been. It had been building for years in small ways, in decisions made without me, in conversations redirected around me, in the gradual shift from being included to being tolerated, and Emily shifted beside him, her shoulders drawing in slightly as if she felt the tension but did not yet know where to place herself within it. And the attorney remained still, his hands resting lightly on the document. As he observed, waiting, allowing the moment to reveal itself further, and Daniel took a step forward, just one, but enough to signal that he was not ready to relinquish control. "It would be more practical," he continued, his tone softening in a way that was meant to sound reasonable, "for us to take over the management, at least temporarily, to ensure everything runs smoothly." And there it was, the same strategy dressed in different words, no longer loud, no longer dismissive, but still rooted in the same intention, to reposition himself back into authority, to reshape the situation into something he could direct. And I let his words settle, not because they held weight, but because allowing someone to fully express their plan often reveals more than interrupting them ever could. And Emily finally looked at me then, really looked, her eyes searching mine as if trying to reconcile the woman she thought she knew with the one now sitting calmly at the center of everything, and for a brief moment, something flickered there, not defiance, not loyalty, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when a carefully constructed narrative begins to unravel, and I met her gaze only briefly before returning my attention to the attorney, because this was not a conversation between mother and daughter. Not yet, this was something else entirely, something that required clarity before emotion, and Daniel continued, filling the silence as if it belonged to him. "We can discuss percentages, responsibilities, make it fair for everyone," he added, the word fair hanging in the air with a meaning that no longer aligned with reality, and I noticed a slight shift in the attorney's expression, not agreement, but recognition, as though he had heard variations of this argument many times before, and I finally moved, not dramatically, not abruptly, just a small adjustment as I placed my hands on the arms of the chair and rose to my feet, the motion steady, unhurried, drawing attention without demanding it, and when I stood, I did not look at Daniel, I did not address his proposal, because his words no longer required a response, they had already been answered by something far more definitive, and instead, I turned slightly toward the attorney, my voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to fill the room without raising it. "I believe the document is clear," I said, and in that moment, it was not just a statement, it was a boundary, one that had been written long before this day, one that no amount of persuasion or pressure could cross, and the room understood it, even if no one said so out loud. For a moment, no one challenged what I had said, not because they agreed, but because the certainty in my voice had left no space for immediate resistance, and that kind of silence is unfamiliar to people who are used to speaking over others, to reshaping conversations until they land in their favor. And Daniel's expression shifted again, the irritation now more visible, less controlled. As if the calm in the room had begun to work against him rather than for him, and he let out a slow breath through his nose, his gaze moving briefly to the attorney as though searching for support that was no longer there, before returning to me with a firmness that felt rehearsed rather than real. "With all due respect," he said, though the words carried little of it, "legal language can be interpreted, and what Robert intended may not align with what is written here." And that attempt, that subtle repositioning of authority, did not surprise me, because when control slips, it is often followed by reinterpretation, by the suggestion that reality itself is flexible enough to be negotiated, and I watched him without interruption, because every sentence he added only made clearer what he was trying to do, and Emily shifted again, her discomfort now more apparent, her fingers twisting together in her lap as if she were holding on to something that no longer felt stable, and the attorney remained composed, but there was a quiet firmness in the way he rested his hand on the document, as though anchoring it in place against any attempt to redefine it, and Daniel took another step forward, closing the distance slightly, not aggressively, but with intention. "We are family," he continued, his tone softening again, trying a different approach. "This does not need to become complicated. We can work together, make decisions that benefit everyone." And I recognized the shift immediately, the movement from dismissal to persuasion, from exclusion to inclusion, but only when it served his position, and I allowed a small pause before responding, not because I needed time to think, but because silence, when used correctly, can reshape the balance of a room more effectively than words, and when I spoke, I did not raise my voice, I did not match his tone, I simply stated what had already been established. "Robert was very precise," I said, my gaze steady. "He did not leave room for interpretation." And the attorney gave a slight nod, not as an endorsement of me, but as a confirmation of fact, and Daniel's jaw tightened again, the shift back to resistance immediate, because certainty that does not bend often creates frustration in those who expect it to, and behind him, his parents exchanged another glance, quieter now, more cautious, their earlier confidence replaced by something more reserved, as though they were recalculating a situation they no longer fully understood, and Emily finally spoke, her voice softer than the others, but carrying enough weight to be heard. "Mom," she said, and that single word held more uncertainty than anything else in the room, not accusation, not defense, but a question she had not yet formed, and I turned to her then, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a calm that came from seeing the full shape of what had brought us here, and I held her gaze for a moment before answering. "This is not about taking anything from you," I said, my voice even, measured. "It is about ensuring that what your father built is handled the way he intended." And that distinction settled between us, quiet but clear, and Daniel exhaled sharply, a short sound that broke the stillness. "Intentions can change," he said, though the conviction behind it had weakened, and the attorney, who had remained patient until now, finally spoke again, his tone no longer tentative, but firm in a way that closed the door Daniel was trying to reopen. "The document is legally binding," he stated, each word deliberate. "And its conditions are not subject to reinterpretation based on preference." And that was when the room shifted once more, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the quiet recognition that the path Daniel had been trying to create no longer existed, and for the first time since the reading began, there was nothing left for him to redirect, nothing left to reshape, only the reality that had been placed in front of him, clear, final, and no longer negotiable. The shift in the room did not come with raised voices or sudden movement, it came quietly, settling into the space between each person like a weight that could no longer be ignored, and Daniel seemed to feel it before anyone else fully understood it. His shoulders no longer squared with the same confidence, his stance no longer occupying the room as it had before, and he looked at the attorney again, not with authority this time, but with something closer to expectation, as if waiting for a correction that never came, and when none arrived, he turned back toward me, his expression tightening as the realization began to take shape in a way he could not easily dismiss, and I remained still, not because I had nothing to say, but because there was no need to rush into the space he had just vacated, because true control does not need to assert itself loudly. It becomes evident when everything else falls away, and Emily's eyes moved between us, her confusion now deepening into something more complex, something that carried the first trace of recognition, not just of the situation, but of the years that had led to it, the small moments she had overlooked, the decisions she had accepted without question, the quiet distance that had grown where closeness once existed, and she drew in a slow breath, as if trying to steady herself in a reality that no longer felt familiar, and Daniel spoke again, though this time his voice lacked the sharp edge it once had, replaced instead by a controlled tension that revealed more than it concealed. "There must be some way to structure this differently," he said, his words measured, careful. "A management agreement, shared oversight, something that ensures stability." And I listened, not with frustration, not with resistance, but with a calm understanding that this was not negotiation, this was adjustment, the final attempt to reshape a position that had already been defined, and the attorney did not respond immediately, allowing the request to exist in the room without endorsing it, and that silence itself became an answer, because it confirmed what Daniel was beginning to realize, that there was no alternative interpretation waiting to be offered. No hidden flexibility that could be introduced to restore what he had already claimed, and his parents remained quiet now, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by stillness, their attention fixed on the document as though it might change if they looked at it long enough, and Emily finally spoke again, her voice softer than before, but steadier. "Dad trusted you," she said, not as an accusation, not as a defense, but as a statement that seemed to land differently now that everything else had been revealed, and I met her gaze, holding it just long enough to let the meaning settle between us, because trust is not something that can be rewritten after the fact, it is something that either exists or it does not, and I answered her simply. He did, and nothing more, because that was enough to acknowledge what had been given, and what had been preserved, and Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, the tension in his posture easing not out of acceptance, but out of necessity, because resistance requires certainty, and certainty was no longer available to him. And the attorney finally closed the folder, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that marked the end of discussion rather than the beginning of it, and in that small action, the room understood something that had not needed to be spoken, that the outcome had already been decided long before any of them had taken their seats, and that the only thing left now was not to argue, not to negotiate, but to accept what had been placed before them, whether they were ready to or not. The attorney's hand remained resting on the closed folder, and that simple gesture carried more finality than anything that had been said, because once something is closed with intention, reopening it requires more than insistence, it requires justification, and no one in the room seemed to have that anymore, and Daniel stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to challenge what had just been established. But no one did, not his parents, not Emily, not even the attorney. And that absence of support did something subtle but undeniable. It shifted him from the center of the room to its edge, not physically, but in presence, in influence, in the quiet hierarchy that had just been rewritten without needing to be announced. And I watched that shift without satisfaction, without resentment, simply observing it for what it was, because moments like this are not about victory. They are about clarity, and clarity often arrives without comfort, and Emily lowered her gaze again, her shoulders softening slightly as if the weight she had been holding was no longer something she could ignore, and I could see the questions forming behind her eyes, not the kind that demand answers immediately, but the kind that linger, that return later when the room is quiet and there is no one else to influence what she sees. And Daniel finally spoke again, though now his voice carried a different quality, less force, more calculation. "So what happens now?" he asked, not to challenge, but to understand, and the attorney responded without hesitation this time, his tone clear, structured. "Mrs. Whitmore retains full authority over the trust and its assets," he said, his words precise, leaving no ambiguity. "Any decisions regarding management, sale, or restructuring will be made at her discretion." And that sentence did not echo. It settled, reinforcing what had already been established, and Daniel nodded once, a small, controlled movement that acknowledged the information without accepting it fully, because acceptance is not something that happens in a single moment. It unfolds, often slowly, often reluctantly, and his parents remained silent, their earlier certainty replaced by careful stillness, as though they were now measuring every reaction instead of offering it freely, and I shifted my gaze briefly toward the window, the sunlight still falling across the table in the same steady way it had at the beginning of the meeting, unchanged, indifferent to the shift that had taken place inside the room, and there was something grounding in that, something that reminded me how much of life continues regardless of what is decided within four walls, and I turned back, not to reclaim attention, but simply to be present within it. And Emily looked at me again, her expression no longer searching, but thoughtful, as if she had begun to see something she had not allowed herself to see before, and I did not speak to her, not because I had nothing to say, but because some realizations need space, not explanation, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture adjusting once more, not in resistance this time, but in quiet acknowledgement that the position he had assumed earlier no longer existed, and he glanced at the attorney again, then at the document, and finally at me, and for the first time since he had spoken so confidently at the beginning, there was no attempt to dominate the moment, no effort to redirect it, only a measured stillness that suggested he understood, at least in part, that the outcome was no longer something he could influence, and the room held that understanding without needing to voice it, because sometimes the most significant changes are the ones that happen without announcement, when roles shift, when authority settles into its rightful place, and when those who once spoke the loudest find themselves with nothing left to say. No one rushed to leave, even though the meeting had clearly ended, because something unspoken kept everyone in their seats for just a moment longer, as if standing up too quickly would mean accepting what had just happened before they were ready to do so, and I understood that feeling, the hesitation that comes when reality shifts faster than expectation, when the version of the future you had already begun to imagine dissolves into something entirely different, and I let that silence exist without filling it, because this was not a moment that required closure, it required recognition, and I reached for my handbag slowly, not as an exit, but as a natural next step, the kind that signals movement without urgency. And the soft sound of the class closing seemed to draw their attention in a way no raised voice ever could, and Daniel straightened slightly, watching me now with a focus that had replaced his earlier certainty, not defiant, not dismissive, but measured, as if he were seeing me clearly for the first time rather than through the assumptions he had built over the years, and Emily remained seated, her hands still in her lap, her expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, as though she had begun to understand that what had happened in this room was not sudden, not unexpected, but the result of something that had been carefully put in place long before any of them had noticed, and I turned toward the attorney, offering a small nod of acknowledgement, not gratitude, not relief, simply recognition of the role he had fulfilled, and he returned it with the same quiet professionalism, his posture unchanged, but his expression carrying a subtle respect that had not been present at the beginning of the meeting. And I moved toward the door without hesitation, each step steady, unhurried, because leaving is often the final statement in a room where nothing more needs to be said, and just as my hand reached the handle, Daniel's voice came again, softer now, without the sharp edge that had once filled it. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used my name that day, not a label, not a dismissal, but my name, spoken carefully, as if testing something unfamiliar, and I paused, not turning immediately, allowing the moment to hold its weight before acknowledging it, and when I did turn, I met his gaze directly, not with challenge, not with distance, but with a calm that did not invite argument, and he hesitated for a fraction of a second, the words he had prepared no longer fitting the situation he now faced, and in that hesitation, everything that had changed became visible, not just the legal outcome, but the shift in how he understood his place in relation to mine, and he finally spoke, though the certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter. "We will talk about this," he said, not as a demand, but as a possibility, and I considered his words for a moment, not because I needed to respond, but because choosing how to respond mattered, and I gave a slight nod, not in agreement, not in refusal, but in acknowledgement that conversations can happen, though not always on the terms one expects, and then I opened the door, stepping out into the hallway where the light felt different, softer, less confined, and I did not look back, because everything that needed to be understood had already been left behind in that room, and as I walked forward, there was no sense of victory, no satisfaction in what had unfolded, only a quiet clarity, the kind that comes when something that has long been overlooked finally stands in plain view. Undeniable, and no longer subject to anyone else's interpretation.